So you want to start a model railroad. Well, at first, we got to consider, maybe you really have no idea what do I want to do, how do I want to model. There's so much, there's too many choices. Well, here I've come up with five points to consider when you're coming up with the best overall ideas for your model railroad. And plus, we really have to consider here. You consider yourself a model railroader first, and then don't necessarily identify with I'm a so and so scalar first. You want to make sure that a model railroader you look at everything, and then decide later narrow down onto a specific what I want to model. And the scale is more of just a tool in order for you to achieve your overall vision. So the first we have to consider inspiration. And this is generally what is influencing. What do you feel? Is it something like you had grandparents, your parents, took you somewhere, you saw some trains you were growing up. Maybe it's literally out your back door. It's trains in your hometown, the place where you currently live. Maybe you've gone into somewhere, museums or trips you took to around this country or other countries. Again, is what's those things that inspires you for running trains. And then along with that is number two, which is vision. Is what do you imagine doing? What kind of you imagine modeling? You would think about, I want to sit back and watch the trains go through, western or southeastern or northeastern scenery, or do I like the grittiness of an urban area switching it either in the past or in today. So then third, things you had to consider is era, is where's this vision residing? Am I wanting to model something like Civil War era or earlier, or maybe it's the 1800s, turn of the century into the early 1900s, was that like wooden passenger cars and steam locomotives? Or do I want a more your classic steam era of the 1920s and 30s, or into the early diesels of the 1940s, the steam area transition into the 50s, first generation diesels of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or even today? Places could I put a model railroad in your current dwelling situation? The point is that everybody has room for a model railroad. So really, first, when I consider, there are some more of these, obvious places. So just, garages, basements, part of a basement, a spare room, a den, a family room, potentially. There's also places like, shelves. Maybe you have a free wall, for instance, like that, or maybe in areas you consider, on top of on the top of, a bookcase or some sort of file cabinets. You want to consider that kind of that wall space too, above and over the top of furniture. There's also places that you could have something within, in a cubbyhole or a cabinet or some sort of a bonus room bump out. Something that potentially is portable that hangs on the back of a door, or maybe it's modules that go on top of a table that can be temporarily set up, or you build something like in a closet, or under a bed. So there's lots of places you could put one, but you really got to think about out of the box and all the possible places. Then only then, when you can figure out, you've brainstormed all the possible places, then you can consider our last point, which is number 5, which is scale. So for like number 5, which is scale, and scale is obviously it's a very personal choice. So it's really, again, it's based on, what inspires and motivates you, and then your kind of what you want, where do I want to, model this, and the era I want to model it. But we also have to consider the realities of all these scales. Keep in mind that any scale could work to accomplish your vision and inspiration, but a lot of it, frankly, is going to depend on your abilities. So, certain choices here may result in you having to do a lot of scratch building, for instance, or maybe 3D design and 3D printing. Maybe you enjoy that. Maybe you do that, and that's not a problem for you. But some people it is, and where they're really more reliant on maybe more on stuff that's available, ready built, and don't have to deal with a lot of the details. mainly because it's really easy at this level here to bite off too much, whether too much in scope or too much in detail. Maybe it's an area that doesn't have any equipment, and you have to bring with scratch build and build everything. That can become very frustrating and limiting. And so you can potentially this hobby is so faceted, and as you can explore many different ideas, but you really don't want to get hamstrung too much. You want to have something in a vision you can achieve. You can achieve it within a reasonable amount of time. So certain scales can work for different things. So, for instance, if you're interested in a lot of that train running, the rural train running, you may want to consider smaller scales, such as N scale, Z scale, or even the small, super small T scale. Especially if your space is limited. Now, if you have something like full basement or something like that, HO or larger can also can still work. So if you're looking at this again, if you're modeling those large scenes, things like that, the horseshoe curve, Tehachapi loop, things like that, small scales really can do that justice without taking a lot of time or space. If you're more interested in modeling trains, I don't care about the actual scenes, but I want to model a full-scale California Zephyr or a modern Amtrak Coast Starlight with all the details, all the cars, and all the equipment, you consider something like HO scale. HO scale, by far has the most equipment available, most detailed parts and decals, things like that, in order that you can create those particular models. Plus, it's not that big. You can do a reasonable amount of model. If you have like your typical spare bedroom, you can do it. You can do a reasonable layout in that kind of space. If you're more interested in modeling individual equipment, pieces of cars or locomotive structures, you may want to consider something like G scales. Now, G scale, for instance, is most typically regarded as the garden railway scale, but plenty of people have done G scale indoors. And then they can get very super meticulous on everything, everything from opening doors and hinges, because G scale is kind of that size, the same thing as the dollhouse scale, so you can get a lot of furniture and a lot of detailed parts that way without having to scratch build them yourself. So again also with certain scales do actually lead yourself to certain eras. If you're modeling something like you want to do pre-1900s, Civil War, turn of the century, really that leads you more towards like HO. And again, that large equipment base, in Z scale, it's possible to do it there. You're going to have to do a lot of scratch building in order to fill out the equipment, which is really not too much is available. N and Z is really best if you want to model maybe the potentially of the 1940s, especially with the transition era, 40s and 50s, and newer for that. Right now, there's a lot of sweet spot now for a lot of 60s, 70s, 80s right now of equipment. But again, if you want to model some modern mainline operation, again, in like Union Pacific, BNSF, there is a lot of equipment available, especially in N and in HO, and so you can pretty much do almost anything you want. Everybody has a place for a layout and has reasonable basis to start your own journey from that. And then again, this can be prototype as I've been mentioning, or potentially you can go off and take inspiration from the prototype and create what they call proto-lance as an example, or you can go completely off and say model cities that don't exist in places, and then you can create your own line, different, especially if you're interested in your ability, for instance, to create your own paint schemes, for instance, whatever you want to do. So you can see that everybody has that ability to model what they want to model, when they want to model it, and then in how, and in what, then in what size. We just have to keep this kind of thought process in place so you can come up with reasonable expectations. Again, it's important not to overdrive your abilities, to come up, or to bite off too much, whether that's in space, time, or money. It is a concern if you want to achieve your modularity dream. So if you like this kind of content, please please give me a thumbs up.